Everybody. So today we're making the transition from talking about biography in general to talking about specific texts. So for this week, I had you read one of the most famous of all biographies written during the Roman period. This was written by Plutarch of Chaeronea, who was one of the two giants among Roman biographers. The other, Suetonius, we'll discuss in a couple weeks. Now, Plutarch is a very different sort of figure from what you would imagine a Roman biographer to be. First of all, Plutarch is not a Latin speaker, he's Greek. So if you look at the map of the Roman Empire that you have in front of you, what you see is that this is a massive space. It extends in the life of Plutarch from basically the Atlantic Ocean all the way into the Syrian desert, and from the Sudan to basically southern and western Germany and parts of Russia. It's a huge, huge space. But if you look at this map, what you also see is a line that goes right through basically where you see Regnum Dacia or Illyricum Caesarea. This is kind of a little bit to the right of the middle of your screen. Beneath that, you see Macedonia, you see Thrace, you see Achaia, you see Bithynia. All of those areas to the right of that line were Greek-speaking areas. And Plutarch was from one of these areas. He was from the city of Chaeronea, which is a city in Greece that's about 20 miles away from the famous oracle at Delphi. So again, if you look at your map, Achaia, SPQR, that's the province where this was located. And then you see over to the right of that little Achaia marker, you see Athens. So Chaeronea is about an hour's drive from Athens now. It's very, very close. Now, Plutarch's family was very wealthy, and Plutarch himself was both a Greek and a Roman citizen. So among the things that Plutarch was able to do, he grew up speaking Greek. He was trained in philosophy at Athens, but he also spoke Latin fluently. And he was very much one of the kind of international elites of this moment. He spent a lot of time in Rome, but he also spent a lot of time in his hometown of Chaeronea. And like many wealthy Greeks, he had what we would call a classical education. And this began in his hometown, and eventually it brought Plutarch to the city of Athens, where he studied philosophy with teachers who belonged to the Platonic tradition. So Plutarch was born in 46, and we know he's in Athens from about 66 to about 67, and then he returned home. And he spent much of his life serving his home city in various capacities, as the equivalent of the mayor of the town, but also when he made some of his colleagues angry, he was also the guy responsible for paying for the cleaning of the city's sewers. But most importantly, he represented the city on a number of embassies to the imperial court. And he also was a priest at Delphi, which means he basically administered the shrine of the oracle at Delphi. So, like many of the priesthoods in the Roman world, this isn't a full-time job. It's more of a volunteer opportunity, and it's more of an honorary thing. So he's not in Delphi very often, but he does do his best to use his connections to advocate for the oracle at Delphi as best he can. So we know, for example, in the 80s AD, he went to the city of Rome and got imperial money to try to renovate the oracle at Delphi. But Plutarch is best known to us not because of these activities, but because of his writings. And many of these writings are biographies, but the surviving works of Plutarch are huge, and the biographies are only a fraction of them. But even among the biographies, the ones we're going to look at in this course are a subset of those biographies. So Plutarch first introduced himself to the world as a biographer in the 70s AD, when he wrote a series of lives of the Roman emperors. And these lives began with the Emperor Augustus, and they continued through the reign of the Emperor Vitellius, who was the third of the four emperors to rule in the year 69. And they were evidently written at some point during the reign of Vespasian, the fourth person to take power in the year 69. And what they were, in essence, was a kind of advertisement for the kinds of services that Plutarch could provide, the kinds of literature that Plutarch could generate. And they worked. This is part of why Plutarch got Roman citizenship, is because he was able to write texts that people in power really wanted to read. Now, unfortunately for us, Plutarch's lives of the Roman emperors don't all survive. We only have two of them, the lives of Galba and Otho, who are the first and second emperors in the year 69, and these are the second to last and the third to last of the entire series. But in addition to these lives of the Roman emperors, once he had announced himself as a figure who had something interesting to say in the city of Rome, Plutarch then wrote a series of texts that advertised the kinds of literary services that he could provide. So the most notable of these was something called the Moralia. And the Moralia is a set of relatively short essays on things that are vaguely related to Plutarch's learning as a philosopher, the sorts of stuff that he studied in Athens, and the kinds of concerns that he has. The Moralia is basically a collection of miscellaneous works. So some of the things in this are works like the religious text on the worship of Isis and Osiris, two Egyptian gods that Plutarch was interested in. There's a philosophical meditation called On Peace of Mind. There's also a dialogue between Odysseus and one of Circe's pigs that's called the Odysseus and the Gryllus. This is really a kind of mixed bag of texts. But outside of the Moralia, Plutarch wrote another big group of miscellaneous things. So one of these was the Spartan Lives and Sayings, again, just a miscellaneous set of materials about Sparta. The Greek and Roman Questions, where he would address kind of trivial questions about Greek and Roman civilizations. But basically, these texts are interesting because they give us a sense of how Plutarch worked. What we see about Plutarch is that he read voraciously. He read a lot in Latin when he was based in the city of Rome. He read a lot in Greek, based in Athens and also in his home region around Delphi. And what we see is that as he read, what he would do is he would kind of read a text and then take the text apart. And anything that he found that was interesting, he would put it on the equivalent of note cards. So if he found something interesting about pigs in anything, he would write it down, put it on a note card, and file that away. So if he wanted to use it later, he could. Now, the note cards are actually probably scraps of broken pottery or papyrus, but he would write these passages down and he would file them. And he had a pretty elaborate filing system to try to keep these things organized. But what this makes his works seem like are kind of jumpy works that move from pithy quote to pithy quote without a ton of argumentative structure. And so the lesson to take away from this is, read Plutarch, but don't write like him. What Plutarch is doing is he's displaying his learning. And the argument sometimes becomes clear, and sometimes it's a little convoluted, and sometimes there's no argument at all. He's just kind of showing off what he's read. But the material that Plutarch is best remembered for are his parallel lives. And the life of Alexandria that you guys are going to read this week, that's where this text appears. Now, the parallel lives are really ambitious work that come late in the life of Plutarch. So this is a mature work as opposed to the lives of the Roman emperors when Plutarch is in his mid-20s. And in the parallel lives, Plutarch puts together 46 different figures from the Greek and Roman worlds, and then he writes their lives and compares them. And the idea was that each pair of figures was a similar type of person, and you could then understand how the historical circumstances of the time affected the behavior of that particular person and that particular type of person. Now, the structure of this is important because Plutarch is writing as a Greek, but also as a Roman. Remember, Plutarch is as Greek as they come, but also as Roman as they come. He's a Roman citizen, he reads Latin, he has extensive time in Rome, but he's also, of course, a Greek. He grew up speaking Greek, he was trained in Athens, he has this connection to the Oracle at Delphi. And so what Plutarch is trying to do with the parallel lives is more or less speak to both aspects of who he was. And so what he's doing is he's taking a character trait as the theme for these parallel lives. And the character trait will be developed by a Greek figure and also by a Roman figure. And so what Plutarch is doing in essence is he's looking at how both Greek and Roman aspects of the historical past that he identifies as his own manifest these particular character traits. Now, what Plutarch does when he writes about this is he's pairing similar types of people so that you can understand how, in a Greek context and in a Roman context, a particular character manifests and develops. But what Plutarch acknowledges is that these people are somewhat different, but he generally feels like they're similar enough in character that you can learn something about virtue and vice by comparing their conduct, because they're similar characters acting in different contexts. And so each of the parallel lives begins with a kind of introduction or a preface in which Plutarch says what he hopes will come out of this comparison. And so he would then write the Greek life first and the Roman life second. And then once he discussed them, Plutarch would add a conclusion that compares the two subjects. And they are, in a sense, paired together to make a very long argument about virtue or vice. Now, the lives, as Plutarch writes them, follows the same basic pattern that we talked about last time. They begin with the person's family, they talk about his birth, and they're all men in the parallel lives. And then they discuss his upbringing, his education, but they spend the bulk of his time on his career before they conclude with the subject's death. And like a lot of Plutarch's work, they move from short story to short story because, as you know, your favorite quotes. There's Plutarch, and there's, of course, our favorite quote. Plutarch is not writing history. He's writing biography. And so what that meant is, instead of a big narration of a battle, Plutarch is much more interested in going to his note cards and giving you a little story that shows you something about the character of the person. Now, these are, of course, stories that are taken from some of the vast reading that he's done, but they're organized in such a way that these little stories, these anecdotes, these little events or discussions are organized in such a way that they develop the argument that Plutarch is making about who this person is and what kind of character he possessed. Okay, so this is the background on Plutarch. What I want to do for the rest of this time is move to the subject of the biography that you're looking at this week. And this is, of course, Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander is probably familiar to some of you, maybe all of you. Alexander is, of course, one of history's greatest conquerors. And if you're Persian, he's one of history's greatest villains. But his is also really, really remarkable career. There's really no historical figure whose experience and background is similar to that of Alexander. So Alexander was born in 356 BC. And it's important to emphasize the distance between Alexander and Plutarch. Plutarch is writing the life of Alexander in the early 100s AD. And so he's writing almost 450 years after Alexander was born. Now, Alexander was born in 356 BC to the Macedonian king Philip II and his wife Olympias. He's Philip's first son, but Philip liked having relationships with women. And so Alexander's not Philip's last son, and Olympias is not Philip's last wife, or even really Philip's favorite wife. Philip divorced her and would get remarried and also have a number of other children. And so this made for a drama-filled childhood, as Alexander and his mother really sort of struggled to assert themselves in this context of Philip's world. But politically, Philip is a game changer for the Greek world. So in the 5th century BC, and I apologize that this map is Paleolithic, but in the 5th century BC, Macedonia is an incredibly marginal place. In Hume 1, many of you talked about the Golden Age of Athens and the authors of the 5th century BC. And the 5th century BC is dominated by the rivalry between first Athens and the Greeks and the Persian Empire, with Athens and Sparta dominating the reaction to Persia. And then beginning in the 460s by a rivalry between Athens and Sparta. And if you look at your map, what you can see is Macedon is really marginal. Athens and Sparta are far to the south of Macedon, and Macedon is not a particularly well-organized political entity. It's seen as backwards by a lot of other Greeks. But by the middle of the 4th century, these rivalries that had dominated 5th century Greece really had played out. Athens and Sparta had fought for much of the second half of the 5th century BC, with Sparta defeating Athens, but then Athens recovering in the 380s, Sparta then being defeated by a combination of Athens and its alliance with Thebes, then Thebes being exhausted before Persia comes back in and imposes a kind of peace treaty on all of the Greeks. For much of Hume 1, what you've talked about is the city-state structure, the polis structure that organizes Greek life. But by the middle of the 4th century, the polis structure is exhausted. And a lot of Greek cities begin forming these larger kind of entities or leagues to try to respond to the weakness that the polis feels and the inability the polis has to deal with outside threats. And so by the time of Alexander's birth, this polis structure in the Greek world is weakening. And Philip, Alexander's father, is ready to take advantage of this. And so while Alexander is growing up, Philip is developing the ability to project power and learning military techniques so that eventually what Philip is able to do is exert power over the Greek world. So Philip, this is actually Philip's body, macabre as it is. That's Philip's armor. Philip's tomb was discovered in the 20th century, and so this is why we have all of these things. And this is the crown that Philip wore. Again, this comes from Philip's tomb. Now, Philip is a military genius. He had spent some of his youth studying as a captive in the city of Thebes, studying how the Theban military, which defeated the Spartans, really worked. And what Philip was able to do was to take the best things from the Theban military and also incorporate some other material and some other tactics to make this force in Macedonia the most powerful force in the Greek world. And so Philip, across the 340s and into the early 330s, began projecting this power in the Greek world. And in 338 BC, Philip's armies defeated the combined forces of Athens, Thebes, and most of the major Greek states at the time in a battle that actually took place, coincidentally, outside of Plutarch's hometown of Chaeronea. Alexander played a major command role in this battle, and in some ways he was responsible for this victory, even though he was only 18 years old at this time. So following the battle at Chaeronea, with all of the polises defeated and sitting under the de facto authority of Macedonia, Philip calls a meeting of all the Greek states to come together at Corinth in 336 BC. Everyone but Sparta comes. And what Philip is doing at that meeting is he declares the intention of all of the Greek states to attack the Persian Empire in response and in revenge for its attack on the Greek world in the 490s and 480s BC. That, of course, is ancient history. It's 150 years since the Persian invasion of the 480s. So what Philip is actually doing is he's not looking really to avenge the Greek defeats and the Greek invasion by the Persians. What he's really doing is he's looking for some sort of way to bring Greece together under his leadership to do something that's productive. And so in this council, there's going to be a league of Greek states. They will lead an army to attack Persia. Philip is to be the commander of that league. And just to make sure that everybody kind of stays in line while Philip goes to attack the Persians, he places garrisons in the Acropolis in the city of Corinth, the city of Thebes, and other strategically important sites. And so the meeting at Corinth was designed basically to put Greeks together so they could fight for a common purpose, but also impose structures that would make the Greeks remain loyal. But something interesting happens before the Persian campaign could be launched. At Philip's, wedding, uh, another wedding, Philip gets drunk and then ends up getting assassinated while the wedding festivities are going on. And Philip is then succeeded by Alexander. And so this is a image of a coin of Alexander. This becomes one of the most common coins in all of the ancient world because of Alexander's great success. Alexander's only 20 when he takes power from Philip. He's a very experienced military commander, but 20-year-olds tend not to be taken seriously by powers that be in the ancient world, with some good reason. And so Alexander's legitimate succession is secure. He has to basically demonstrate the authority necessary to govern Macedonia as a king. And so with Alexander's succession secure, he convenes another assembly of Greek states, not long after the one Philip had convened, and he asks these Greek states to confirm him as the leader of the Persian campaign. And they do this, but they do this really without much enthusiasm. Because before Alexander set out for Persia, he had to secure his position in the kingdom. And to secure his domestic political position, what he had to do was actually campaign along the borders of the Macedonian kingdom with the area to its northwest, an area called Illyricum. And so while Alexander is... right after Alexander has conducted this discussion in a council of Greek states, he then puts together lightning attacks on two areas of Illyricum. And he does this to not only show the other Macedonian nobles who might be tempted to rebel that he actually is firmly in control of the state, but also just to tell the Illyricans that there's no chance that they're going to be able to take advantage of this young king by invading Macedonia. But something interesting happens in the course of these Illyricum campaigns. In the course of them, a rumor reaches the states of mainland Greece that Alexander has been killed in battle. And this sets off a rebellion against Macedonian rule. Now, even during Philip's lifetime, Greek states were unhappy with Macedonian domination, and so there were discussions of trying to use the Persians to get money to intervene or to try to overthrow Philip's control over them. But when word reached Greece that Alexander had been killed in battle, many Greeks began to angle to lead a larger revolt against Macedonian control. And the central place for this was the city of Thebes. Now, following the Battle of Chaeronea in 336, this had been a kind of central place to which a lot of the resources from Macedonia had been directed. The power in the Greek world that had dominated the Greek city-states before Macedonia was Thebes, and so Philip was particularly concerned about keeping Thebes under control. Now, a number of exiles from Thebes had gone into Athens, and when they heard about Alexander's supposed death, they returned to their home city, incited a rebellion, and then besieged the Macedonian garrison in the citadel of the city. And other Greek cities, when they hear about this, begin to think about doing something similar. But suddenly, while the Thebans are very excited about their revolt, Alexander appears at the head of his army a few miles from the city of Thebes. And he marches to the walls of the city, and then he stops, showing the army and hoping that the citizens would stop the revolt and just return the city to his control. But they don't. He's 20 years old. They don't respect him. They don't know what he's capable of. And so 2 days later, the Macedonians launch an attack on the city. Now, there's a rule in ancient warfare that says that in an ancient city, if there are negotiations ongoing, there is every reasonable expectation that as those negotiations proceed, the city will be spared and it can set the terms under which it will be spared. But once hostilities start, once the ladders hit the wall, so to speak, then negotiations are over. And everyone in the city is basically subject to whatever the person attacking the city wants to do to them, if the city is taken. And when the Macedonians launch this attack, they quickly overwhelm the defenses. They get into the city, and they begin slaughtering the population. And Alexander, in his anger, orders the entire city razed, except for its temples and the house of the poet Pindar. Now, this is not something that Greeks did. When Greeks take major cities like Thebes, they don't do this. They don't raze the entire city. They don't enslave the entire population. And Alexander did this to send a message. He did something that was basically unprecedented because he wanted to shock Greece. And we have to remember that just 20 years before this, Thebes was the most powerful city in all of Greece. And now it doesn't exist, like at all. It doesn't exist. And so all Greece is shocked. They can't understand this. This isn't how things are supposed to work. And such a thing had never really happened before. No Greek city had gone from such a prominent position to not existing so quickly. And Alexander had done what he hoped to. He terrified the Greek world, and he put Greeks in their place. And then Alexander set out on his Persian campaign. While the Greek states probably thought that the Persian campaign of Alexander wasn't going to be any different than Philip's planned invasion, Alexander had his own very distinctive ideas about what he wanted this Persian campaign to do. In Philip's idea, the Persian War really was not about conquering Persia, it was about unifying Greece. And the Persian War was a nice excuse for him to channel Greek energies away from thinking about their independence and towards exerting power under Philip's control towards the agenda or the goal of taking Persia. And so this was really a campaign that was not about Persia so much as it was about Greece. But Alexander really saw things completely differently from his father. Now, what Philip's campaign probably would have looked like is he would have led this Greek force into some part of Western Asia Minor, what's now Western Turkey. He maybe would have fought a small battle. He probably would have won it. And then he would have compelled Persia to make some kind of peace treaty on favorable terms to the Macedonians. Perhaps taking the Greek city-states on the western coast of Asia Minor and making them independent of the Persians. But it was a limited campaign because the Persian Empire is massive. This is how you can see the extent of the Persian Empire. It extended from the western part of what's now Turkey all the way down to the edge of Libya, and then as far east as India itself. It's massive. It's the biggest state the world had ever seen at that time. And Philip had no interest or really capacity to take over all of that territory. But Alexander had different ideas. Alexander was young. Alexander was ambitious. Alexander was not particularly realistic about the limits of what he could achieve. And so what Alexander thought the Persian campaign would do was very different from what Philip thought the Persian campaign could do. If Philip was looking at the western edge of this Persian Empire, Alexander was looking at the entire thing. And so when Alexander set out, his goal was to take the entire empire, or at least go as far as he could. And this was, of course, insane. He set out with 30,000 troops and 5,000 cavalry. That's it. It's a small force to take over something as big as the Persian Empire. And the strategy that Alexander adopted was also extremely risky. He knew that his troops were better than what the Persians could put together. And so his strategy was to force the Persians to put together the biggest armies they could, confront his armies, and then defeat them. But there's a very easy way to blunt that kind of strategy. You don't put all of your forces together. You don't give the massive battle to Alexander that Alexander wants. And Ataturk, in the aftermath of World War I, shows how to defeat Alexander's strategy in this very region. You just pull the troops deeper and deeper in, you cut off their supply lines, and eventually they get worn out, and then you can annihilate them at a place of your choosing. But this isn't what the Persians decided to do, though they could have decided this, and maybe would have decided this, if they knew what Alexander's actual strategy was. So the first wave of attack was launched in Asia Minor. And the campaign in Asia Minor proceeds just as Philip's campaign probably would have proceeded. Alexander lands a force in western Asia Minor, and then the first battle is at the river Granicus. And you can see on your map Granicus in the far kind of upper left of the map. And in this battle, Alexander attacked a detachment of Persian cavalry and a group of Greek mercenaries. That army was an army put together by the governors of Asia Minor. It's a Persian army, but it's a Persian army put together using the resources of that region. And this is how the Persian Empire worked. You wouldn't generally see a Persian cavalry force drawn from Afghanistan fighting in Western Asia Minor. Instead, the Persian Empire entrusted that the people in Afghanistan would put together forces in Afghanistan to fight in Afghanistan. You wouldn't mobilize the entire empire generally to deal with a local campaign along one of the borders. And so this was a force from Asia Minor, made up mainly of Greek-speaking mercenaries and others from Asia Minor, and it was about equal in size to what Alexander's forces had, and it was basically about equal in the kinds of tactics and people that it had available. Alexander, leading the right wing of his forces, is able to destroy that Persian force, and then he marches along the coast of Asia Minor and removes the Persian garrisons from the Greek cities there. The main resistance to this was in the city of Miletus. You can see Miletus on your map as well. This was the head of the Persian government in this area, and it held out for a little while until Alexander reduced it. But then Alexander does something very interesting. Alexander had been supplying his army with a fleet of ships that could sail supplies back and forth from the Greek mainland to Asia Minor. And so what that meant is the Ataturk strategy of cutting off Alexander's supply lines wouldn't work because that Greek naval force was strong enough that it could resupply Alexander's troops. But Alexander realized that as he went deeper into the Mediterranean, there are large Persian forces that come out of Phoenicia, what's now Lebanon. Large naval forces, and those could potentially disrupt his supply lines, and he didn't actually want to have to deal with defending this naval force. And so what he does is he disbands it. He sends those ships back to the Greek mainland, and instead he tells his army and orders his army to effectively live off the land and build supply lines not based on connections back to mainland Greece, but basically connections based on the territory that he had conquered in Asia Minor. He's going to fight basically off his supply lines. And while Alexander was doing this and moving along coastal Asia Minor, the Persian king Darius III organizes another large army. And this army was designed and was intended to prevent Alexander from getting through the next big choke point in the Persian defenses. Now, Greek forces had been active and had at various points taken the Greek city-states in Asia Minor out of Persian control. The Athenians did it in the 5th century, the Spartans did it in the early 4th century, and so that part of the campaign was something the Persians understood. But what the Persians also understood is once Alexander started pushing deep into Asia Minor, this was a real challenge. This was something different than what the Persians had seen before. And the next big geographical choke point was near where you see the city of Issus, I-S-S-U-S, on the map. This is a place called the Cilician Gates. It's a very narrow crossing that separates the Anatolian Peninsula from the Middle East, more or less, from Syria and the rich areas of the Levant. And so what the Persians understood is if Alexander is actually going to campaign in a way Greeks have not before, they needed to close access to the fertile plains of the Fertile Crescent by basically blocking Alexander from getting through the Cilician Gates. And so Darius organizes a large army to confront Alexander at Issus, at a place that will prevent him from getting into the rich areas of the Levant and potentially even into Egypt. Now the Persian forces here, again, outnumber those of Alexander, but they're commanded by Darius, by the Persian king himself. And so what you see here is a representation of Isis. Darius is the person in the chariot. Alexander is the man in the man riding the horse on the left. The battle, of course, didn't take place this way. Darius was not leading the charge into Alexander. It was not man-to-man combat between them. But what we see is the Persian forces outnumber Alexander's troops, but Alexander's troops are better, and they're more flexible in the way that they fight. And so Alexander defeats the Persian troops, and defeats them so heavily that Darius is forced to run away from the battle, and Alexander's cavalry pursues him, and they're almost successful in catching Darius. Darius escapes, but Darius's mother and his wife do not. And they are captured by the Greek forces and remain prisoners with the Macedonian forces as Alexander advances across the Middle East. And so with the victory at Issus, the Middle East, Syria, and Egypt lay open to Alexander. Meanwhile, the Persian fleet going out of what's now Lebanon had been sailing to the Greek world and had been looking to stir up a rebellion in Greece to try to prevent Alexander from advancing further into Persian territory. And evidence for this was found when Alexander sent a small force down to the city of Damascus to try to take the city. And when they entered the city and entered the royal treasury in the city of Damascus, they found 3 Greek envoys, an Athenian, a Theban, and a Spartan. And these were envoys that were trying to negotiate the terms of this Greek revolt. But when news of the Battle of Issus came, all Greece was shocked. This was not the sort of victory that a Greek commander had ever won against the Persians before. So all preparations for rebellion are put on hold. And Alexander has a particularly interesting response to the Persian naval campaigns and the Persian naval connections they were building between Lebanon and the Greek world. Most Greek commanders in the past would have fought a naval battle to destroy those Persian forces, and to actually destroy a navy by fighting a naval battle. What Alexander decides to do, instead of fighting a naval battle to destroy this Persian navy, is to fight a series of land battles to capture the home cities that provided the ships to the Persian navy. And so Alexander spends the next year after the Battle of Issus marching through Syria, Phoenicia, and Egypt, securing possession of all of those coastal cities that had been providing the Persians with their fleet, and basically eliminating the naval threat and also the communications between the Persians and the Greeks by basically taking all of the naval bases out of Persian control. 2 places put up particular resistance. One was the city of Tyre, a Phoenician city that at that point was an island, and it took Alexander fully 6 months to take the city. This is a major naval power, and so being an island with a significant navy meant Alexander really had no good options to take it, since he himself did not have a fleet. And so what he did was he eventually built a causeway out to the city and then attacked it by land. The other place that put up resistance was Gaza, a city that served as the gateway to Egypt, but this fell with a lot greater ease, and once Alexander was there, Egypt was open to his forces. And once Egypt had been conquered, Alexander received an embassy from Darius, offering him all of the Persian territory west of the Euphrates River, as well as the Persian king's daughter in marriage. Now, Alexander, at this point, sensed desperation on the part of the Persian king. And this desperation was reinforced. So there's Alexander at Issus. Here again, we see Alexander's advance down through, from Issus down to Tyre, and then through Gaza, and then ultimately into Egypt. Alexander sensed Darius's desperation in making this, basically this offer to give him the western third of the Persian Empire and also marry him into the Persian royal family as a way to secure an alliance and prevent Alexander from continuing this campaign. This was a better deal than any Greek had ever had been offered by a Persian king. This was an incredibly generous peace treaty. But of course, Alexander is not interested in moderate successes. Alexander wants the entire Persian Empire, and he wants to come up with some way to make his mark on this Persian Empire. And so while Alexander is in Egypt, he begins a series, he begins to pursue a process by which he's going to make his mark on the territory that he's conquered. And so at the far, far western edge of the Nile River, he founds a city that he calls Alexandria. And this is a map of the city of Alexandria. Alexandria will become one of the greatest cities. Alexandria in Egypt will become one of the greatest cities in the ancient world. But Alexandria in Egypt is the first of 29 Alexandrias that Alexander will found across the territory that he's conquered. And this shows Alexander now thinking in a very different way. What Alexander is now thinking about is how it is that he's going to govern and control all of this massive territory that he is putting under his authority. And this means that Alexander has now committed himself fully and completely, if he hadn't already, to the conquest of the entire Persian Empire. And so in 331, the year that Alexander had spent taking control of the Eastern Mediterranean and founding the city of Alexandria, Darius began planning what he was going to do to try to prevent Alexander from successfully taking all of the Persian Empire. And so what he had done is he had gathered the biggest army that he possibly could, assembling troops from what remained of Persian territory. Now, the western part of the Persian Empire was the place that provided the Persians with their fleet and also with a lot of their infantry. But the eastern part of the Persian Empire provided the cavalry, and it provided some of the most impressive and fast-moving and flexible military formations in the world. It had cavalry, it had archers, and in 331, when Alexander was founding Alexandria, Darius also had weapon engineers strategize to come up with weapons that might blunt the tactical superiority of Alexander's infantry. Alexander's infantry was based on a formation called the hoplite phalanx, in which soldiers fought very close together, held shields and spears in a very tight formation that needed to stay together. And if it was broken in any way, the hoplite phalanx was extremely susceptible. Traditional hoplite phalanxes had soldiers carrying shields that covered only one part, only their left side, and then the right side of the person standing next to them. They also had long spears, and the hoplite battle involved more or less large groups of these people standing very tightly together, moving slowly into each other and sort of pressing against each other in almost a slow motion kind of rugby scrum, except with spears and heavy armor. What Darius's weapon engineers realized is if you can make members of a hoplite phalanx freak out, if you can make them panic in any way, the phalanx could break. And if the phalanx breaks, you can run cavalry right through the middle of it and then attack these guys from behind. And much of the weaponry and the armor of a hoplite phalanx involves moving forward. It doesn't involve sort of turning quickly and defending your back. And so if troops get behind you, the phalanx is going to be annihilated because it just doesn't have the defensive capacity to respond. And so Darius's weapon engineers, in the year Alexander spent marching through the Levant and taking over the Middle East, Darius's weapon engineers came up with something that they thought would defeat the hoplite phalanx. And this was a Scythed Chariot. And you see in this picture what a Scythed Chariot actually is. It's a multi-horse chariot with spears that projected forward, and then along the wheels of the chariot were giant blades that would spin as the wheel spun, and obviously cut up the legs of anybody who was standing in their way. This is a weapon designed to terrify, Because the way that you defeat a hoplite phalanx is you terrify those people. You make them afraid. You make them scared. They will break their formation, and if you see these giant blades cutting people's legs into pieces, that's scary. That's scary enough to make you break your formation. And so the goal was to use these chariots to puncture holes in Alexander's line, and then the Persian king would send their cavalry through the breaks while their archers rained missiles on the phalanx. And you could in that way, completely destroy the infantry advantage that Alexander had. And this would have worked against a regular Greek infantry force. But as we'll see, it ignored the real skill of Alexander as a commander, and it also ignored the fact that the infantry that Alexander had, these are not Greek peasants. These are not the sorts of people that the Persians confronted in regular fighting in the Greek world. These are really good, really scary, really well-trained troops. They don't freak out very easily. So Alexander knew what kind of direction to give. He was very, very smart in how to respond to challenges that appear on the battlefield that were unexpected, and his troops didn't scare easily. And so when Alexander's army met the Persian army at the Battle of Gaugamela, what Alexander was doing, at least in Darius's mind, was walking into a trap. The battlefield for Gaugamela had been specifically chosen by Darius. Darius had specifically decided where they would fight. It was on ground that was particularly well suited to the kinds of cavalry, archers, and Scythed chariots that Darius wanted to use. And to overcome the terrain advantage, Alexander, when he recognized what Darius was trying to do, he began to shift his positions to outflank Darius. And as Alexander was shifting his positions, Darius released his Scythed chariots. What he was hoping was the phalanxes that Alexander was mobilizing, as they were moving, would be unable to respond effectively to what Darius was sending at them. But when the Scythed chariots were actually released, the flexibility of Alexander's lines, his skill as a commander, and the courage and the fortitude of his men meant that they were able to very quickly move to the side, make the chariots kind of run right through the lines without any sort of damage at all, and then basically the lines would come back together. And in the end, Darius's Scythed chariots did nothing. They didn't really scare anybody. They didn't really break the lines. And Alexander's superior infantry was able to annihilate Darius's infantry, and then his cavalry was able to chase them down. Darius again fled with the remaining troops, whatever was left. Alexander tried to pursue them, but again Darius was able to escape. And instead, what Alexander did was he then marched through the major cities of Babylon and took control of Babylonia and took control of the city of Babylon. And then after a little bit of time in Babylon to regroup, he began to advance again. Now the thing that's interesting about the Persian Empire is the Persian Empire controlled a lot of territory in the Middle East, but the core of the Persian Empire was actually, of course, in Persia. This was territory that the Persians had absorbed. It was, in a sense, imperial territory. But in December of 331, Alexander marches into the actual Persian homeland. And now the Persians are not losing the territory they've conquered. They're losing their own territory. In December 331, he marches into the summer capital, the Persian summer capital of Susa, and takes control of it, and with it, a large part of the Persian treasury. And then from Susa, he advances into the Persian heartland, to the royal palaces of the Persians. And he sent half of his forces by a long inland route, and then he took an army of his own through a shorter route that went through the Persian gates. Now, the Persian gates are the next choke point that prevents further advances. The Silesian gates prevent advances into the Middle East. The Persian gates prevent advances into the really core of the Persian homeland. And it was defended, it's a narrow mountain pass that was defended by a large number of troops. But Alexander is able to turn those troops away by finding another way around the Persian gates, sending a force that went behind the Persian defenders, and then Alexander pins the Persian forces against a wall that had been set up to prevent passage across the Persian gates, and attacks them from two sides and inflicts a major defeat upon them. It's now 330, and Alexander is in the major Persian cities, the major royal cities of the empire. And the most notable deed that Alexander does while he's in the royal cities of the empire comes in 330 in the city of Persepolis. Xerxes' palace, the palace that had been built by the man who had invaded Greece in the 480s, Alexander has a party in Xerxes' palace, and eventually, as a result of this party, Xerxes' palace burns, as does the city of Persepolis. Now, as you'll see in Plutarch, there are two stories about what actually happened. One story is that this burning of Persepolis was the accidental result of a drunken party. Now, drunken parties are a normal feature of Macedonian life. Philip was killed at one such party. And this is what Macedonians do, especially when they're happy or celebrating, and they have a lot to celebrate at this moment. And Alexander himself was an alcoholic, and as his life proceeded, he would be increasingly incapacitated by that addiction. And so the fact that Persepolis is destroyed as the result of this party, well, okay, that's maybe understandable, maybe it was an accident, but there's another interpretation as well. And this is that the destruction of Persepolis was actually revenge for the destruction of Athens by Xerxes. And in this case, it's a deliberate act of genocide. Architectural genocide, cultural genocide, and to a degree, regular old human genocide. Now you can choose your own explanation. Plutarch gives you both of them, but this is a significant event, and it's one that continues to live in the minds of Persians to this day. So Alexander is called Alexander the Great by a lot of people, but in Persia he's Alexander the Devil, and it's in large part because of what he did to Persepolis. The destruction of Persepolis, though, doesn't end the war. It's followed by the murder of Darius by his courtiers, and then a kind of disintegration of Persian power, with people mounting resistance not as the Persian Empire, but as people who want to resist Alexander's empire. And so Alexander was now effectively, so there's the gates of Persepolis, Alexander is now effectively the sovereign in charge of the Persian Empire, but he needed to spend the next few years cleaning up these scattered rebellions. And so this is what he does. And you can see on this map where all these scattered rebellions are concentrated. There's northern Iran, there's Afghanistan, there's Pakistan. But after he more or less wraps up his control of this territory, the next few years, after these revolts are concluded, he has to figure out what he wants to do next. And the important thing to understand about Alexander is Alexander set out to conquer Persia, not because it was a political objective to conquer Persia, but because, in a sense, it was an achievement. It was an adventure. It was something that he wanted to do because he wanted to see if it could be done. I don't know if he ever actually expected to really succeed in conquering the whole thing, but when he did, his idea of needing to continue this adventure, needing to continue to see what the limits of what he could achieve actually was, this continues to animate him. And so after the Persian Empire is completely reduced, Alexander decides, well, to the east of the Persian Empire is India. The Persians are not able to reduce India, and the world more or less ends with India in Alexander's mind. So Alexander wanted to control the entire known world, and India was the next step in this. Now, Alexander and the Greeks didn't really know of China. They didn't know how far north Russia went. They didn't know about Japan. Of course, they'd never seen the Americas. And so they thought the world ended not very far past the Indus River. The Persian Empire more or less went to the Indus River. Alexander wanted to push beyond and see what was there. And so Alexander then set out to control the rest of the known world that he didn't already possess. Again, kind of motivated by this megalomania and this insatiable desire to keep doing things, to keep fighting, to keep trying to achieve these steps. Now, the first major battle of his Indian campaign came in 326 BC, and it came against the Indian king Porus. And the battle against the Indian king Porus produced something that was different from what Greeks had ever seen before. Because the Indian king Porus, a significant part of Porus's cavalry was elephants. And it's, I think, hard for us to understand or to remember what it's like to see an elephant for the first time. When we see an elephant, of course, we have ways to contextualize large moving things. We've seen dump trucks, we've seen garbage trucks, we've seen like those giant mining trucks with tires that are 30 feet tall. And so when you see an elephant, we have a frame of reference, right? We can look at this and we can say, oh, okay, animal dump truck. Greeks had never seen anything really bigger than a horse that moved. And so when they come into battle against war elephants, that is scary. It's really scary. Asian elephants are big. Asian elephants are armored. And Asian war elephants, are trained to march into lines of infantry, use their tusks to spear people, and use their trunks to pick people up and throw them. This is not the kind of fighting that any Greek had ever seen before. And so when they come into the battle with Porus, these hardy, hardened, really, really brave men don't know what to do with elephants. Because there's something else different about elephants. Cavalry on horses will not charge into a phalanx. Some of the spears that phalanxes use are 15 feet long. Horses don't want to charge into that. Lines and lines and lines of spears. Horses are smart enough to know not to do this. But an elephant that's armored can do this. It will do this. And it will do this in a way where it will, use its trunk and use its tusks, and it will break a phalanx. And so hoplites, Greeks serving in Alexander's army, they not only had never seen an elephant, they'd never dealt with a straight-up cavalry charge by something that would actually run straight into a phalanx and basically start breaking it up by doing horrible things to the people in the phalanx. Plus, elephants scared horses. And so Alexander's cavalry wouldn't function effectively when it was confronting large numbers of elephants. At the same time, Alexander is a genius. And Alexander is not easily flustered in military engagements. And so while his men are struggling to deal with elephants, what Alexander realizes is if you can't kill the elephant, you can kill the driver. You can kill the mahout that's running and directing the elephant to do these things. So kind of like in Lord of the Rings, right? When Legolas climbs up the giant Oliphant and defeats it by knocking the guy who's driving it into the other world. And so what Alexander decided to do was to use javelin throwers to take down the mahouts. And then the elephants will freak out and they'll run away, and you can kind of blunt them by having the elephants run amok. And this worked. Barely. Alexander did win the battle against Porus, but only just barely. And after that victory, a very interesting thing happens. Now, Porus is a border kingdom. When you read the accounts in Plutarch, and you read the Roman authors that write about Alexander's career, they make Porus out to be some sort of super Indian king, king of all of India. He's not. He runs a small border kingdom, and the number of elephants he has is relatively limited. If Alexander had campaigned deeper into India, he would have encountered far more elephants than he did before. And Alexander's soldiers have no interest in doing this. While Alexander wants to push deeper into India, his soldiers revolt. And in 324, they force him to turn back. And so Alexander is forced by his soldiers to return to Babylon and begin running his empire, begin figuring out how this territory isn't going to expand, but how he's going to consolidate control over it. The problem is, Alexander had no interest in that kind of thing. Alexander was a conqueror. Alexander liked campaigning. He liked the adrenaline of thinking how one can take new territory. He had zero interest in thinking about the boring parts of administration and how one could govern that territory. And so when Alexander returns to Babylon, he starts deteriorating mentally and physically. He gets back there and dies in June of 323 without having really figured any of the administrative problems out. And it's said, instead looking to defer those administrative concerns further by planning a new set of campaigns, either in the Arabian desert or, we're told by Plutarch, against the people called the Romans. When Alexander died, he was only 32 years old. Now, the character of Alexander has fascinated historians because no one quite like him has ever walked the earth. He's basically the prototypical modern hero to Greeks, Romans, and a lot of later peoples. In part, this is because Alexander is a one-act play. Alexander is a conqueror, and Alexander's career is not sullied by his failures as an administrator because, frankly, he died before he really had to do much administering. He would have been a terrible administrator. I think everybody can acknowledge this. But that's not part of his story. And so Alexander the hero becomes Alexander the Great because he conquered the world and then died. We're told, though, that this influence of this image of Alexander as the great conqueror who dies young in the prime of his life influenced a tremendous amount of people. Julius Caesar, for example, we're told, cried on his 33rd birthday because he'd never be as accomplished as Alexander. But in many ways, what you see is Alexander is a character who's driven by his passions. The lust for glory and the insatiable desire to continue to achieve incredible things motivated him. And this is a lust for glory in like a Homeric sense. Alexander kept a copy of the Iliad with him throughout his campaigns. We're told he actually slept with this copy of the Iliad. But Alexander is also a character of his passions in a kind of negative way. He's an alcohol addict. His drinking is legendary, and it seems by the end of his life, the drinking had not only consumed him, but started to make him erratic. And he's also a figure who, in the last part of his life, becomes very different from what he was for much of his life. And this is something Plutarch has to figure out how to handle. Because for most of his life, Alexander is a prototypical Greek, a philosophically influenced person, a student of Aristotle, and somebody who really valued the Greek virtues as much as possible. But in the later stages of his career, and especially after his troops refused to continue campaigning in India, Alexander makes a turn and becomes more Persian, more interested in training Persians to fight the kinds of wars that his Greek troops no longer will fight. And what we see also in Plutarch's telling in particular is this increasing Persianness of Alexander changes his character in a way that makes him not less virtuous, but less able to express the virtues that he has and more susceptible to the limiting vices that the virtues had previously controlled. And so when Plutarch is writing about Alexander, what he's trying to do is give you a uniform character, a uniform sketch of Alexander that, in the ancient way, doesn't really change. What you see are basic characteristics that are constant throughout, but the way they manifest change based on the kind of context in which Alexander is operating. And so what Plutarch is giving you is a complicated figure, a figure with tremendous virtues, but also some vices. And the balance between those virtues and vices is precarious. It's something that Alexander maintains for much of his life. And when he does, of course, the Greek virtues are manifest and dominate and dictate what it is he's doing. But later in his life, those Greek virtues begin to be overcome by Persian vices. And so Plutarch has to walk a very careful line there, because he wants Alexander to basically be a virtuous figure. But in the end, it's a very difficult task to tell the story of somebody who for much of his life corresponds to the virtues that Plutarch believes are ideal, but for the last part of his life starts to slip away. So next lecture, what we will do is look at how Plutarch handles this very sort of difficult process of explaining the character of Alexander in a way that is nuanced and also consistent.